My name is James Milius. I'm a senior here at Hillsdale, originally from Beaverton, Oregon. I'm studying philosophy and sociology, and I'm here to introduce our speaker for tonight. Dr. Frank Dikötter is chairman and professor of humanities at the University of Hong Kong and senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. Previously, he taught at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London, from which he earned his PhD. He has written numerous books, including The Discourse of Race in Modern China, China Before Mao, The Age of Openness, and Crime, Punishment, and the Prison in Modern China. Dr. Dikötter is the author of People's Trilogy, a work that documents the impact of communism on the lives of ordinary people in China. The first volume, Mao's Great Famine, won the 2011 Samuel Johnson Prize for Nonfiction. The second, The Tragedy of Liberation, was shortlisted for the Orwell Prize in 2014. The final installment, The Cultural Revolution, was shortlisted for the Penn-Hessel-Tiltman Prize in 2017. Would you please join me in welcoming Dr. Frank Dikötter?
Good evening. Thank you for coming. I'm delighted to be here. A little jet lag. I arrived from London yesterday. I got up at 5 o'clock in the morning. I couldn't wait any longer, so at 7 o'clock, I went outside and walked around the campus. So here's a fact. There's nobody to be seen in Hillsdale on a Sunday morning at 7 o'clock. Not a soul. I did see a few chaps. One of them is called George, and a very distinguished lady called Maggie. Now, if 30 years ago, somebody would have asked Margaret Thatcher, what is the organization department in the People's Republic of China? Or, for that matter, the Organization Bureau, or Org Bureau, as the Russians used to say. I think she would have frowned. I think she would have said, young man, back you go to Communism 101. About a month ago, at the Hoover Institution, I was asked to speak to 20 senior congressional fellows, all very smart, all quite distinguished. I asked them, do you know what the organization department is in the People's Republic of China? Not a single one of them knew what that was. So, understanding China is this theme of this conference. If you do not know what an organization department is, you do not understand China. It's as simple as that. If you do know, you don't have to say. But there's good news. At the end of my talk, you will know what it is, and I hope you will have a better idea of the entity that we are dealing with. My brief is to talk about the Chinese Revolution, which starts in 1949. I will focus mainly on the 30 years under Mao, but I will also spend about 8-9 minutes talking about China over the last 40 years, bringing it up to date. Now, like the organization department, or the Org Bureau, everything invariably starts in the Soviet Union. In this case, it starts with Stalin. No Stalin, no Mao. It's as simple as that. On the 6th of August, 1945, Hiroshima in Japan is erased in a blinding flash of light. 2 days later, Stalin sends 1 million men across the border from Siberia into Manchuria, the industrial powerhouse of China to the north of Beijing. They are on their way to Korea, where they wait for their American allies along the 38th parallel. Japan surrenders. The Russians don't leave. They hand over North Korea to Kim Il-sung, and the countryside in Manchuria to the Chinese communist leader Mao Zedong. They help him transform his ragtag army of guerrilla fighters into a formidable fighting machine. The Russians establish 16 military institutions, including air force, artillery, and engineering schools. Some Chinese officers go all the way to Moscow for advanced training. Logistical aid arrives by rail and by sea. In North Korea alone, some 2,000 wagon loads are allocated to the task. The Americans, on the other hand, impose an arms embargo on their wartime ally Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists. Chiang Kai-shek loses battle after battle in a war of attrition in Manchuria. By 1948, the communists feel strong enough to start surrounding cities and blockading them. In the case of Changchun, Lin Biao, one of Mao's generals, commands the city to be transformed into a city of death. His troops establish a perimeter around Changchun, trenches 4 meters deep, and do not allow anyone to leave for 5 months. 160,000 ordinary people are starved to death. Zhang Zhenglong, a lieutenant with the Chinese Communist Army, noted later on that Hiroshima and Changchun were the same. Hiroshima took 9 seconds, Changchun took 5 months. The casualties were roughly the same. Other cities surrender, unwilling to undergo the same fate. By the end of 1949, Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists flee to Taiwan. The red flag goes up over the forbidden city in Beijing. It is called liberation, a term that brings to mind jubilant crowds who welcome the liberators. But liberation is the result of a long and brutal war of conquest. Power, Mao used to say, power comes from the barrel of a gun. But Mao knew very well that the People's Liberation Army could only keep power for so long. What was required was a revolution, the overthrow of the old order. And it came in the guise of a campaign for land reform. It had very little to do with the land. It had everything to do with power. Communist work teams fanned out into villages and polarized closely knit communities into a majority obliged to denounce a minority of victims, frequently the democratically elected village leaders. Some villages did this with relish, But a great many had no choice, because those who refused would be denounced in turn. The victims were denounced as landlords, tyrants, evil gentry, humiliated, beaten, sometimes killed, their assets distributed to the crowd. So in effect, ordinary people entered a pact sealed in blood with the party. All of them had blood on their hands. All of them had participated in the persecution of a small number of victims. They did not want Chiang Kai-shek and the Nationalist Party to return. This is land reform. A year later, in October 1950, Chairman Mao decided that it was time to eliminate all the enemies standing in the path of the revolution: spies, bandits, counter-revolutionaries. He issued a killing quota of 1 per 1,000. Go out, kill 1 per 1,000. In many parts of China, local cadres, some pronounce this as cadres, local cadres or Communist Party members try to vie with each other and show their revolutionary determination, so that this quota doubled or trebled. In the South, some of these party activists used the campaign of terror to settle accounts with the local population who had resisted the arrival of the communists. Entire villages were erased. In some cases, school children as young as 6 were accused of spying for the nationalists. Sometimes a few prisoners were simply taken out and shot for a local official to meet his killing quota of 1 per 1,000. People were supposed to be shot in public, in rallies taking place in stadiums, which all had to witness. But in many cases, they were taken deep into forests, along rivers, near ravines, alone or in batches. About 1.5 to 2 million people were eliminated, coming on top of the 2 million people denounced as landlords during so-called land reform. So by now we're counting in the 4 to 5 million victims. Many more were stigmatized for life and disappeared into a sprawling prison system across the country. To paraphrase Simon Schama, the historian of the French Revolution, violence was the revolution. But of course, violence had trusted companions, namely fear and intimidation. People across the realm were asked to transform themselves into what the party called new people. They had to go back to school, in factories, in offices, and learn the right answers, learn the right ideas, learn how to shout the right slogans. They had to confess, account for their past activities, demonstrate their loyalty to the party, possibly denounce colleagues, neighbors, family members. But of course, there's more than just violence and intimidation. The history of revolution in China is also a history of promises made and promises broken. Mao, like Lenin and the Bolsheviks, promised every disaffected group what they wanted most: more land for the villages, freedom of speech for intellectuals, independence for minorities, protection of private property for entrepreneurs, better working conditions for the workers. One by one, these promises were destroyed as Mao imposed a harsh Stalinist system on the country. One by one, the enemies were eliminated. It started first with the counter-revolutionaries at the height of this campaign of terror that I just described. But then the campaign moved on to target former government servants who had been promised lenient treatment by the communists in 1949, but were eliminated or targeted in 1952. And after that, the business community was brought to heel. Every organization outside of the organization of the Communist Party of China was eliminated. Religious communities, philanthropic associations, powerful chambers of commerce, labor unions, all of them eliminated and replaced by the party. By 1956, all enterprises were nationalized and became functions of the state. If you had been running a corner shop in Shanghai, then you would be pleading with the party to be allowed to continue to work as a state employee. The land was taken back from all the villagers who lost their freedom of movement by 1956. They had to sell the grain they produced to the state at state-mandated prices. But something happened in 1956 that upset the chairman. His model, Stalin, had died 3 years earlier. In February 1956, his successor, Nikita Khrushchev, in a secret speech that very much shook the socialist camp to its core, denounced Stalin, his reign and terror, and the cult of personality. Mao viewed it as a personal attack. He, after all, was China's Stalin. His answer was to come up with a great leap forward from socialism into communism that would somehow leave the Soviet Union behind. His hope was to upstage Nikita Khrushchev and become the leader of the socialist camp. Hundreds of millions of ordinary people in the countryside were herded into giant collectives called people's communes. These people's communes were modeled on the army with collective canteens, collective dormitories. By transforming every man and every woman in the countryside into a foot soldier in a giant army to be deployed day and night to transform the economy, Mao thought that he could catapult his country past the Soviet Union. But the Great Leap Forward was a disaster. It led to literally tens of millions of people being starved, beaten, worked to death. Villagers had no incentive to work. The land was no longer theirs. The tools, utensils, even pots and pans had all been confiscated. They were literally bonded servants of the state at the beck and call of local cadres. They earned work points to be exchanged for food in canteens. But the cadres, on the other hand, had to whip up the workforce in one relentless drive after the other, produce more fertilizer, more grain, more steel from backyard furnaces, that to whip up the workforce. So the scope and degree of coercion had to be constantly expanded, resulting in a mounting spiral of violence in order to get impoverished, famished people to work. They were pummeled, beaten, whipped, some of them tied up, thrown into ponds, covered in excrement, branded with sizzling tools, occasionally buried alive. But the most important tool at the disposal of party cadres to punish people who didn't work hard enough was food. Food was used as a weapon. In many parts of the country, those who were too weak or too old to work were deliberately banned from the canteens and allowed to starve to death. What I'm trying to say is that people didn't simply starve to death, they were starved to death. The Great Leap Forward came to an end in 1962 at great cost, and it damaged the standing of Mao Zedong. He wondered whether somebody might destroy his legacy, as it happened with Stalin. Would there be a Chinese Khrushchev to denounce him, even as he was still alive? And most of all, how would Chairman Mao be able to spot the Chinese Khrushchev, since Stalin himself had been unable to identify his own nemesis and had even promoted Khrushchev through the ranks of the party? Mao's response was the Cultural Revolution. He prepared it very carefully. It began in 1966, 4 years later. The Cultural Revolution was designed to be an attack on feudal, bourgeois, capitalist culture that Mao believed was a threat to communist ideology. But Mao also used the Cultural Revolution to unleash ordinary people and punish all those inside the party hierarchy who had ever expressed any doubt about him and the Great Leap Forward. First, students in the summer of 1966 were allowed to criticize their teachers. They rapidly became Red Guards and also attacked what they referred to as the old world, burning books, vandalizing churches, tearing down temples, attacking any sign of the past. In Shanghai alone, they raided 250,000 homes, taking away ordinary books, family photographs, but also antique bronzes, rare paintings, all of it destroyed. They also attacked people they suspected were enemies of the revolution. In Beijing alone, in September 1966, 1,700 of them were killed. A few thousand petrol and set alight, a number also electrocuted. In the autumn of 1966, Mao went further and allowed ordinary people to criticize ranking party members, which they did. But people, of course, became divided over who the true enemies of the Cultural Revolution were. So they started fighting each other. And the army intervened as Mao asked them to support the true proletarian left. But different officers in the army weren't quite sure either who they should fight, and ended up fighting each other in the streets. The country was on the very edge of civil war. This episode comes to an end in 1968. A so-called new revolutionary party committees appear. They represent a command structure that Mao relished, top to bottom, one man in every place, a military structure. And these so-called revolutionary party committees were heavily dominated by the army, with soldiers overseeing factories, schools, offices. They turned China into a garrison state. Their first act was to punish all the students and Red Guards who had taken the chairman at his word, sending literally millions of them to the countryside to be re-educated by the peasants. Other purges followed. In Shanghai, anyone with a foreign link in the past was seen to be suspect. 170,000 people were harassed, thousands killed or committing suicide. In Guangdong province alone, the province just across the border from Hong Kong, where I work and live, one estimate puts the body count at 40,000. But of course, Mao was suspicious of everyone, and also the army that now ran the country. In September 1971, Lin Biao, the very man who had besieged Changchun in Manchuria in 1948, conveniently died in a plane accident. Now the army was purged in turn. At this point, in 1971, ordinary people in the countryside realized that the Cultural Revolution has badly damaged the Communist Party of China. The credibility of communism was destroyed by the Great Leap Forward and the famine, but the organization of the party was undermined by the Cultural Revolution. Ordinary people, villagers, start what I refer to as a silent revolution. Even before Mao dies, they take back the land. They take back their tools. They open black markets. They operate underground factories. They return to the past. And there's not a lot the party can do about it. No party would have tolerated open confrontation. But these are millions and millions of daily acts of resistance as people wrench away from the state very basic economic freedoms. Mao dies in 1976. 3 years later, a man referred to as Deng Xiaoping takes his place. Short, nasty little man. He had purged intellectuals in 1957, and he would do the same again and again and again. But Deng Xiaoping at first attempted to force villagers to go back to the people's communes. He soon realized that he didn't have the clout to do it. So he was wise enough to step back and allow ordinary people to just get on with their economic business. The people's communes collapsed in 1982. From here onwards, very basic economic freedoms produce economic growth, but economic growth is used by the party to rebuild itself. Deng Xiaoping and his followers are determined to allow some economic leniency, but equally determined to suppress every political aspiration. There are many twists and turns in this story, not least the massacre around Tiananmen Square in June 1989. But overall, human ingenuity managed to thrive despite the constraints of the one-party state. A few have acclaimed what has happened since 1979 as nothing short of an economic miracle. Well, if you look at the gross domestic product per capita, according to the International Monetary Fund, China ranked number 126 in 1980. By the time the tanks moved into Tiananmen Square, it has moved up to 121, where it remains until the end of the 20th century, only to increase by 5 ranks up to 2007. At that point, it is just below Zimbabwe, and the Mugabe is gone. Thank God for that. And just below Zimbabwe, just above Turkmenistan. That's where China is in 2007. It is true that after the crisis in 2008, it jumps all the way up from 116, jumps all the way up to 76. Quite an achievement. In fact, for anyone who has visited China 10, 15, 20 years ago, it seems as if it is a different country. And indeed, one of the accomplishments of the regime today is to have distanced itself so successfully from the Mao era that it doesn't even appear to exist. There are no monuments to the victims of the Cultural Revolution, no memorials for the tens of millions who died during Mao's Great Famine, but on the other hand, skyscrapers everywhere, bullet trains, modern airports, modern railways, roses along the highways. It's almost like a paradise, isn't it? But when you scratch that shimmering surface, what you will discover underneath are the iron underpinnings of the one-party state. The very institutions put in place by Mao after 1949 have been spruced up. There is, for instance, the propaganda department, which hasn't changed its function since Mao, although today, conveniently, it is translated officially into English as the publicity department. Then there is the Ministry of Security and the Ministry of State Security, two giants that reach out into every single household. There's the Bureau of Statistics that produced the numbers required to portray the Great Leap Forward as a miracle. And the Bureau of Statistics continues to produce the figures that the party demands. And then, of course, there is the organization department. And anyone familiar with communist regimes will immediately identify as the one that is responsible for appointing leading party members to shadow every government institution. If Hillsdale were to be taken over by the Communist Party of China tomorrow, God forbid, it would mean that the mayor of Hillsdale is appointed by the organization department. The president of Hillsdale College is appointed by the organization department. The organization department will appoint a party secretary to every department and decide who teaches what should be researched, and who should be invited. My feeling is I would not be welcome. After 1949, Mao destroyed all organizations outside of the organization of the Communist Party of China. He placed the party in a position to rob the people of their assets. That situation has not fundamentally changed. The land belongs to the state. The banks belong to the state. Industry belongs to the state. Major enterprises are controlled directly or indirectly by the state. Economists have observed that consumption levels tend to be low in the People's Republic of China. They are low because the wealth goes to the state and from the state to the party, not to ordinary people. Well, you might object and say, it's not communist. They allow private property. Really? But every single leader from Mao Zedong onwards, including Deng Xiaoping, has made it crystal clear that there will not be separation of powers, and there is none. There is no judicial independence, which means that there is no rule of law, which means that you cannot defend your private property. If you read the Constitution, you will find out that what is referred to as socialist property is apparently sacred, but not so private property. You might say, but there are plenty of billionaires in China. Yes. They occasionally disappear for a while. They either reappear on TV to confess, or you never see them again. Their assets now belong to the state. And other billionaires then scurry to prove their loyalty to the party. In essence, despite all the talk about reform and opening up over the last 40 years, the Communist Party has remained in charge of the economy. The commanding heights of the economy are controlled by the party. You may very well argue that there are relative merits to a one-party state. For instance, stability, or at least the appearance of stability during economic crises. For instance, the one in 2008. But to think that the Chinese Communist Party will undertake meaningful economic or political reform, I think is mistaken. Its hand is everywhere and will not move of its own accord. To think otherwise, to believe that political reform will follow economic reform, as every American president has done from Nixon onwards, except for the one in Washington today, is to engage in what I call a China fantasy. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Dikötter has agreed to sign copies of his book, Mao's Great Famine, directly following this session in the Searle lobby outside. And we now have time for a few questions. So please make your way to the microphone if you have a question. And I am reminded by our director that students who ask good questions will be considered for extra credit. Okay.
You say that, I learned that you're a professor at the University of Hong Kong. How's it like teaching there with the situation that's going on right there, right now?
It's a good question, but I haven't taught there the last 3 months. In fact, I haven't even been in Hong Kong. I was at the Hoover Institution in July and August. I've been in Europe since. I was only in Hong Kong for 1 day. I was happy the airport was open. Having said that, I have nothing but admiration for the people of Hong Kong. And I have to say, I have slightly less admiration for the police. I understand that occasionally you might wish to use tear gas and fire rubber bullets and club people on the head. But you must have a strategy that the only result is that these demonstrators move from one street to another. It seems rather pointless. It fuels anger. It creates more protesters, more grievances. What is crystal clear is that many of these very young people, some of them probably my own students, are utterly determined because they've seen whatever few freedoms they have being very gradually undermined by the one-party state across the border. In 1997, Hong Kong was returned from Britain, was a crown colony, to the People's Republic of China. People's Republic of China undertook to not change its institutions for 50 years and promised free elections. That promise has been broken. Now those few freedoms are being crushed. People are upset, and rightly so. I have nothing but admiration for them.
All right, next question.
Thank you for your talk. From my limited knowledge of Chinese history, it seems that the regime has had various weaknesses that you've pointed to. But with the recent implementation of their social credit system and the massive surveillance state that they've built, it seems that they would be able to correct a lot of these weaknesses, and I wonder if you might be able to speak to that.
It's important not to overestimate your enemy. It's important not to underestimate him either. We tend to think of dictatorships as societies which are beautifully regimented from top to bottom. The truth is, under the Nazis, under Stalin, under Mao, it is chaos. Why? Because there's never just one dictator. There are a million of them. I'll be my little dictator here. There are thousands of rules and thousands of regulations. They're implemented according to the whim of the person who happens to be in charge. It creates chaos on the ground. It's true to this day. I go to China this year. Before July, I went virtually every second week. There are cameras everywhere in Shanghai. People, we are told, will be fined if they jaywalk. I do it. Everybody does it. Happily. Except if there's a policeman standing right there to stop you. But as he stops you, somebody else will cross. Anarchy. When I travel, I'm always a little apprehensive because these people at airports, railway stations, customs as I cross the border from Hong Kong into China are obviously unable to read a passport. They don't know who I am. How do you spell my name? It's all a great mystery. So before we get to this Orwellian state where everybody's registered and regimented, I think China will have a very long way to go, with one exception. And that is, of course, the outer realms of the empire. The Bolsheviks inherited the Tsarist Empire. Mao inherited the Qing Empire. The boundaries are the same. They haven't decolonized yet. So when it comes to Tibet and Xinjiang, there are definitely cameras everywhere. And every means possible is used to punish people. There are more cameras probably in some villages in Tibet than there are textbooks for children. These are tremendously poor villages, yet you will see cameras on every street. So in that sense, yes, it's definitely a threat.
Hello, I have a quick question regarding the Xinjiang and the Inner Mongolia and the Tibet. Sun Yat-sen, I believe he said that one of the reasons he couldn't implement democracy into China immediately was because people weren't ready for, the country wasn't unified yet. So somebody had to unify the government first and then allow for freedom and elections. Is this what the People's Republic of China is doing with their Sinicization of the Xinjiang, Inner Mongolia, and Tibet in order to prevent separatist movements once they democratize?
So there's two questions. One is Sun Yat-sen, one is what happened after 1949. Very clearly, this is an empire that pretends to be a nation state. So what you see is the same time zone, whether you travel to Xinjiang or to Manchuria, regions that are extremely far away from each other. There's the imposition of Mandarin, one standard language at the detriment of local languages. Everything is to do with unification, with the imposition of one particular standard, one culture, one time zone, etc., etc. But I wish to say something about Sun Yat-sen. He may very well have said that, but the truth is that after the empire collapsed in 1911, China was the very first republic in Asia. Some 40 million people voted in 1912, or 10% of the population. It was an electoral representation that was not reached by Japan till 1928, I think, India till 1935. There was a huge interest from 1912 until 1949 in participatory democracy. There were civil associations. There was an attempt to separate out powers and build up an independent judicial system. All too often, we skip the entire first half of the 20th century, as if Mao somehow came from nowhere. But the truth is that the Republic of China, the period from 1912 to 1949, demonstrates that China can perfectly well be a democratic, open, thriving society. And that's what we have to bear in mind.
All right, so thank you for coming to Hillsdale. I appreciate you coming.
So trying to be pragmatic here in September of 2019, you mentioned right at the end of your talk about not engaging in a China fantasy with the current administration. So I want to hear your thoughts on what we're doing right, what we're doing wrong, how our current dispute with China is likely to end, specifically with the tariffs and the trade war. So I wanted to see what your thoughts were on that. Well, I don't know how it will end. I'm a historian. I study the past, not the future. But you want my guess? Well, as I pointed out at the very end of my talk, for the first time you have a president who seems to know how to unsettle that regime profoundly. And you have somebody who appears to understand that the biggest threat to your freedom and mine as well comes from the People's Republic of China, with the largest organization on planet Earth devoted to crushing the very values of freedom and democracy. Now, is the trade war the right way of doing this? Well, my understanding of Adam Smith and free trade is that we live on an island. You know, you're good at fishing. You have 5 fish. I have 5 coconuts every day. We exchange. You're wealthier, I'm wealthier. But as I pointed out, when Europeans buy stuff from China, when Americans buy stuff from China, the theory would be that Chinese people will buy stuff from Europe and stuff from the United States, but they don't. It's called financial repression. The wealth flows to the party. Their bank accounts belong to the state. The state does as it sees fit with the money of other people. It will build these empty airports. It will build these empty railways. It will build up that mighty army it has. So in that sense, it's not free trade, and it most certainly isn't fair trade. So again, the trade war seems to me to be a reasonable approach. All the more if you study the economy of China since 1979 and you realize how extraordinarily dependent they are on earning foreign currency. In the beginning, I said everything goes back to Stalin. And we may think of the economy today as being utterly different. But what did Stalin do with the first famine, first communist famine, 29, 32, 33? He took massive stocks of food from the countryside to sell it on the international market in order to buy the industrial equipment needed to modernize the Soviet Union. He wanted foreign currency. That's exactly what Mao did. That's exactly what Deng did. That's exactly what Xi does. The only difference under Deng, under Mao, trade would be with the socialist bloc. Under Deng, it's with the rest of the world. But this is a machine devoted to making sure that China can sell as much as possible at a very small margin. There are tax rebates, there are subsidies, there are massive, huge state structures behind it. And all of that foreign currency is needed to keep the rest of the country afloat. So if you poke a hole in that, then you see the leaders in Beijing scurry, because they are so incredibly dependent on you and your US dollars that you will weaken them very quickly.
Okay. Thank you, for coming out tonight. I have a question pertaining to the issue of Hong Kong and ultimately the ideology of China. It seems one consistent theme throughout. Want me to just hold it? I'm supposed to hold it. Okay, gotcha. Yeah. It seems like one consistent theme is the method doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is the result, which is more power or the control over the people, whether it be modernization or literally tearing down a culture. How then can the United States defend cities like Hong Kong or an entire quasi-country like Taiwan when the government literally does not care about the means but securing what they want? Is there any actual strategy we can draw up, or is it just simply like playing checkers back and forth?
Well, as I said, don't overestimate your enemy, don't underestimate him. We may think that Hong Kong is just a small city of 8 million people with its laws, with its independent judicial system, and across the borders, 1.4 billion people. They call it one country, two systems. Really seems a little unbalanced, doesn't it? Hardly fair for 8 million people to put up a fight to preserve, not acquire new freedoms, preserve the ones they have. What can you do if that 1.4 million machine is determined to crush Hong Kong? Well, guess what? Goes back to what I said earlier on. The wealth goes to the party and party members. Do you think they have any faith in their own system? No. These billionaires who I mentioned occasionally disappear, and their wealth from one day to the next becomes state property. If you're smart, you have money, you place it in Hong Kong. There are thousands of companies in Hong Kong from the mainland. Some 60% of inward investment comes from Hong Kong. 60% of outward investment goes through Hong Kong. It is vital. They've tried to replicate it with Shenzhen and Shanghai, and they've failed because they don't have separation of powers. So sometimes it just seems that you're fighting a monster that you can't beat. But remember, the Soviet Union was the same story. In the 1970s, people would come back from Siberia and say, oh, these Soviets, they're going to overtake the world. Oh, they've got a system we can't beat. You know, they crush democracy, but the result is a strong man. They can do things we simply can't get away with. It's a lost fight. How could you possibly fight them? Well, it disintegrated more or less, with a bit of help from another chap who's out there, Ronald. He's a bit fenced off, though. So there are many tools that you can use to fight the one-party state, and many of these tools actually come straight in Europe, in this country, from our experience of the Cold War. And one approach of the Cold War is to have one standard for everyone, not a double standard. And this is the issue. So much knowledge about the Soviet Union, and the moment we talk about China, it's as if all that knowledge just evaporates. Why? Because when we used to talk about the Soviet Union, it was about politics, not about culture. Nobody in his right mind would stand up and say, the Soviet Union is a different culture, you know. That's the Orthodox Church. No, the Orthodox Church was crushed, survived. No, we talk about China, it's the exact opposite. It's not about politics, it's about culture. Read Henry Kissinger. They're not really communists, it's Confucian culture. These people are wonderful, they're not true communists. 3 presidents said this. Roosevelt, he thought, oh, these are just agrarian reformers. So Let's not help Chiang Kai-shek. Mao Zedong is a good chap. Well, a few years later, they were fighting them in Korea. Didn't go all that well. Nixon, Kissinger, same story. Oh, it's Confucian culture. They're not like the Soviet Union. We should use them against the Soviet Union. Allow them access under Clinton, under Reagan, I'm sorry to say, allow them access to our technology, sell them weapons, have their students do things we would never do with the Soviet Union till it collapsed in 1991. Then Clinton, 94, after the Tiananmen massacre. Same story. Help them with their economy, and they will reform as surely as the cart follows the ox. Didn't happen either. One standard. You sign a treaty, you respect the treaty. You say you will do something, you stick to your word. One standard for treatment of human beings. Thank you.
Next. Are you okay for a few more questions?
I'm happy to go on for as long as you want. As far as I'm concerned, it's 2 o'clock in the morning, so.
I hope it doesn't take that long. I'm not very good at this. About 25 some years ago, I established a 100% foreign-owned company in China, and about a year ago, I sold it, I engaged, at my wife's help, who is Chinese, I engaged a local, very high-level accountant to advise me on how to deal with the cash, several millions of dollars, and said, well, maybe, buy a new car or something. He said, oh, no. You better not do that. We have to be very careful with this. If this is not spent just exactly, you can go to jail. Go to jail? The question, I've been getting the question, I'm sorry. So I said, well, my children have $100,000 tuition coming up. Can we spend on that? Oh, sure, no problem. Is China ever going to allow me to spend that money how I would like to without having to go to jail? I mean,
I will give you my
it's a very daunting
for $1,000 fee. I don't think you'll go to jail, but all these billionaires in China are a lot smarter than you are because they grew up in this system. And they are desperate to get their money out of the country. So chances of you succeeding are pretty slim, I'm sorry to say.
All right, we have time for one more question.
Capitalism, free movement of goods, people, not in China.
I want to thank you again for coming out here tonight. So you've spoken a lot about the ways in which Mao took things from Stalin's ideology and Stalin's implementation of policies. However, I know that those who are sympathetic to Mao or to the Chinese system would be quick to point out differences between what Mao and Stalin did, and would point out that they often disagreed on certain things. I was wondering if maybe you could speak a little bit towards to what extent some of those differences might be substantial and to what extent they are superficial.
You want another lecture? I'm happy to give you one. I talked briefly about how Mao destroyed every organization outside of the organization of the Communist Party of China. Well, what do you think Adolf Hitler did after 1933? Here's your German word of the day, Gleichschaltung, a process of synchronization in which the Nazis, over the course of 2-3 years, take over every single institution down to your local sports club. Now, all cultures eliminated and replaced with Nazi paraphernalia. Where did he get it from? He got it from Lenin. Lenin was the first one to do it. Ultimately, of course, these are different. The Mao of 1949 is not the Mao of 1956. The differences between Mao and Stalin are plentiful. You can find all sorts of differences. But to emphasize difference is to not see the overall picture. And the overall picture, I think, is reasonably straightforward. In the 20th century, you have two trends that are opposed. One is to separate out powers. Goes back to that French chap, Montesquieu. Don't you do philosophy? That's what I thought, and sociology. Tough. Montesquieu first came up with the idea of separation of powers. Other philosophers did so too. For centuries, in parts of Europe, United States, other parts of the world, people have been working very hard at coming up with checks and balances, an independent judicial system, complicated arrangements, where sometimes you have to hire a lawyer. Can Boris Johnson do this or that? You need lawyers. Difficult. Not sure. He might end up in jail. It's a great achievement. An extraordinary achievement for any government seen from the Stone Age onwards. Human beings club each other. For all of a sudden, a government to respect a court order is an extraordinary achievement. That's one trend. The other trend is the concentration of power. With Lenin, with Hitler, Mussolini, you name it. These dictators think that all that wishy-washy separation of powers only weakens the entire entity. What you ought to do is concentrate powers in the hands of one party represented by one person. So yes, I could go on about differences between Stalin and Mao, but ultimately it's the same mechanism. It's the same vision. It's the same desire to control power and keep it firmly in the hands of the party state. I'd say one difference is that Stalin, at the height of the terror in the 1930s, at least had the courage to sign all the death warrants. There are about 1.5 million of them. He had to sign these long books with lists of names. He signed it. Mao pitted people against each other. He made sure everybody had blood on their hands. But it's a minor detail. Ultimately, it's the one-party state that is barely different from the beginning of the century to the very end. Thank you. Thank you.